So you tuned into the Voxit show here at Mo Radio South African campus. And in studio with me is our new member of the Voxit show. I'm very excited to have Ogi Williams on board. He'll be touching international relations and just discussing like what is happening in this globe. So a very warm welcome, Ogi. I trust that it's going to be an insightful year here at the Voxit show, and we're looking forward to having you here.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm very grateful to be here as part of this. And yes, it will definitely be a very exciting year. Many news to discuss, many different topics, and a lot of things that we can talk about.
Ogi, just give me a brief overview. I know you're still a current student, post-grad student here at Monash South African campus. Tell me a bit more what you're studying at the moment.
At the moment, I'm busy completing my MPhil in International Studies. And my dissertation is focused on China and energy. And more specifically, I'm looking at what exactly are they busy applying in terms of their foreign policy to get energy security throughout the globe.
That sounds very interesting. So we are so happy to have an insightful academic on board at the Voxit show. So you can have a follow on Twitter. It is at Voxit show. And you are also a representative for a non-profit organization. Please tell me more about this non-profit organization that you are partaking in.
Okay, well, basically, that non-profit organization is called Young People in International Affairs, and short acronym is YPIA. And what we do is basically form connections and network between various universities, various students across the globe and on the continent. And we try to make links and connections in terms of international relations. And at the same time, since it's a non-profit organization, the whole aspect of it is run by volunteers. Some of them are part of Monash South Africa, some are part of other universities in South Africa, others are part in universities throughout Africa and the rest of the world. So basically what we're trying to do is make the connections possible that are currently not there in order to strengthen international relations and affairs throughout Africa and the world.
And I know the Voxit show will also be pod streaming on your website. So for all the listeners on the YPIA website, a very, very warm welcome from studio here in Mo Radio Reimsig, broadcasting fun times. Today's topic of discussion, we'll be looking at freedom of speech. What's happening in Zimbabwe at the moment with regards to press, media, and freedom of speech?
Okay, well, as we all know, especially in the southern part of Africa, Zimbabwe is quite a sensitive topic. And one of the biggest issues in terms of what's happening in Zimbabwe is the censorship on the media. So a lot of media in Zimbabwe is state-owned. Basically, the government has total control of what is being said on air, whether it be on radio or television or even in the newspapers. And anything that is not part of that solution or part of that bracket in terms of the state does not own, and it's a private media company, it's censored as much as possible, and a lot of times licensing is revoked. As well as journalists from different newspapers from around the world and different media outlets like Al Jazeera or BBC. They have a lot of issues getting licenses or being accredited to broadcast from Zimbabwe. So it puts a lot of restriction on freedom of speech, as you say, and expression in terms of the information that comes in and out of the country, as well as what is broadcast to the people inside Zimbabwe.
Yes, that sounds so interesting and alarming with the same tone, you know. What I'm hearing is propaganda, you know, and can you actually call it broadcasting in that sense? You know, if governments wholly governs the media and what they have to say about it. So just tell me, when did this whole saga start with the legislations of Zimbabwe and broadcasting within the borders of Zimbabwe?
Okay, well, basically, since independence in 1980, the government did put in place, certain steps to give more freedom of expression and freedom of the media. But during the mid-90s, there was quite a few developments in Zimbabwe. For instance, the involvement in a Pan-African initiative in the Congo, as well as the Robert Mugabe party ZANU-PF paying reparations to all the war veterans from the 1980 struggle. So that drew a lot of the Zimbabwe budget to places where previously there was no allocations for it. And what happened was it caused a lot of discord within the country. So in the late 90s, more and more protests were starting to take place in relation to the economy and where it's going. And from that point onwards, the government started putting a lot of restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, one of the main ones being the media. So any and all private entities that were present up to that point in time were now highly restricted. And as I say, access was barred for a lot of media to present the news objectively as opposed to subjectively. So unless it was pre-approved by the government, it had a big problem getting on air.
And you know, Ogi, that is actually to a much smaller scale that's happening. What we've been coming to realize with smaller broadcasters within South African borders is that basically it's owned by a specific company, so we're not mentioning any names out there.
Yes.
And it's actually infringing on the information bill, as well as not to report on certain aspects because it is infringing or might cause harm to the sponsoring unit of the broadcasting station. This is what I've been picking up is, can you actually call that news if it's been subjectively produced and that you can actually not say your say? To what extent is that infringing our human rights if I ought to, a Zimbabwean citizen?
Well, it's obviously a huge restriction on freedom of speech and human rights, as you say. Without the freedom of expression, it's basically taking it back to even Cold War era, where the communist part of the world was not allowed any Western media or information coming from that side of the world. And basically, the government would have total control of that. And despite the happenings of, whatever negative instances there might be occurring throughout the country, the government would still report positively on it, or would somehow have a spin-off to the story in order to seem it less harsh, or it's as having a less of an impact on society. Meanwhile, the complete opposite was taking place. So having that restriction is a big part of how you control not just society but how the country develops. So having those restrictions is basically putting the brakes on development in terms of all aspects of society, whether it be economics, politics, society, journalism. Anything and everything is basically now slowed down substantially because of this lack of freedom of speech. It is quite an issue. It's not just, in Zimbabwe, there's many states throughout the continent and throughout the world where the same is prevalent. We're looking at the specific case as something that has been taking place more and more in the past decade or so, since post-2000 when the Zimbabwe crisis ensued. So since then, there's been heavy restriction on freedom of speech as well as expression, and limitations on what the media can and can't publish.
Now the question is, Ogi, for the general public out there in South Africa, I asked the question, is this being implemented? Do they have something to hide from the general public and international relations and news? Why is this being, the news and information being censored within Zimbabwean borders?
Looking at it from a purely political standpoint, it's easier to manipulate information which you could use for various means. I mean, you could obviously censor any and all opposition parties. So, for instance, information or any private broadcast that, say, for instance, the Movement for Democratic Change, the MDC, is trying to put out there through the media in Zimbabwe is now censored, which means that in the rural areas where there's only access to, for instance, radio, it's very difficult for people to get any other viewpoint other than the mainstream, which is ZANU-PF. So in that sense, people from the rural countryside will always vote for the majority, and the opposition party will have very little say on the airwaves about their policies and what they're trying to implement and how they're trying to take the country forward. So in essence, it's basically making it a one party by just restricting the media. Having no information from the opposition means that why should you vote for them? What's the point of even supporting something that you don't know anything about? And that's the whole point of the censorship of media, so that the ruling party remains in power and the opposition is entirely censored. By doing that, you can implement any and all policies, not just for the short term, but continue doing that for the long term, say 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Even though they'll have elections 5 years from now, it doesn't mean that there'll be a change in government. It means that simply there'll be someone else at the head of the state. So it's basically all that it's doing. It's ensuring that the ruling party stays in power indefinitely.
You're tuned into the Voxit Show. In studio with me is Ogi Williams, participant of the YPIA non-profit organization, and we're talking international relations and issues that are happening in the globe. And we are talking about Zimbabwe and freedom of speech, and basically how this is impacting the broadcasting sphere within Zimbabwean borders. So Ogi, tell me a bit more with regards to certain legislations and laws. How restricting are these laws, and how is it affecting the country as a whole, as well as, you know, the media regarding international news and relations?
Zimbabwe in particular has a number of laws and acts that they've passed over the past 10 years. Notably, there's the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act of 2002. What that basically says is that the powers vested in government in terms of what should and should not be made available to the public. And at the same time, it also provides for the registration of mass media providers and the accreditation of journalists with the Media and Information Commission. So unless you are accredited by the MRC and the government has indeed approved what you're about to broadcast, you can't get it broadcast. It will just stay mum, and there's no way of getting that information out because of this act. Furthermore than that, there's also the Broadcast Services Act, which of 2001, which regulates radio and television. And also the now defunct Zimbabwean Broadcasting Corporation Act, which governs the broadcaster. Basically, all these things are put in place in order to limit the freedom of expression and the media in general. So to regulate any and all information, as I've said, and to also make it more difficult for private entities to put the news out. So in essence, it allows only the government to basically negotiate what gets put on radio and what doesn't, and it gives them the power to say no. If they don't like it, it won't be aired.
Okay, now, Ogi, I have a question. If I was now practicing journalist in Zimbabwe and I had to reveal certain information which I did not run by government, what will the implications be? Would I go to jail for exploiting government content?
Well, yes. If you are found in violation of this act, you're most likely to be arrested. I'm not quite sure what the charges will be, but definitely that you are broadcasting illegally, and that what you are broadcasting is in fact unfavorable to the government, which is persecutable in Zimbabwe. Again, it's just another way to limit what is said and what isn't said on the airwaves via the printed press or on television. And again, there's no way of getting around that unless you get approval from the government. In other words, the MRC says, yes, you are now an accredited journalist, you can broadcast from Zimbabwe.
Now, Ogi, I have a question with regards to the globe and taking Zimbabwean news to the foreign countries out there. What impact does that have with regards to international news and the perception of what is actually happening within Zimbabwe?
Well, it now becomes very difficult to tell what the situation is on the ground. So, for instance, in the last elections of 2007, it was very hard to actually understand what exactly is happening during the election period, who's in the lead, policies are being implemented to govern the elections. All those things, they're not being mentioned by the media, and with a purpose, so that no one really knows exactly what's going on the ground. And post that election, there has been a development in terms of normal citizens in Zimbabwe still want to get the information out of Zimbabwe. From 2002 onwards, there's been quite a development in terms of underground media, and more specifically pirate radio, which has had quite a reasonable amount of success, both overseas and in terms of Zimbabwe. So what these underground radio stations, some of them include Shortwave Radio Africa, the Voice of the People, and Voice of America's Studio 7. These radio stations are now not allowed to broadcast in Zimbabwe, so they have found other outlets to beam the news across into Zimbabwe, as well as to make the news more available online through the internet. So what they have done is set up various, fan sites, like for instance through Facebook, or websites like the actual website of the broadcaster. And what they do is they beam the news across via the web into Zimbabwe. Obviously, internet's also restricted in Zimbabwe in terms of what can you view, what can't you view. Because of one of the acts, there's also a limitation on what can be broadcast via the internet. And the minister can, in fact, invoke power to censor certain websites, not allow them to be available on the Zimbabwean population. So It makes it a lot more difficult than you think. But because of these developments, I mean, some of these radio stations are enjoying quite a bit of success. Like, for instance, the Voice of the People has over 50,000 online visitors every month. At the same time, having this radio online gives the ability to have feedback and discussions take place. Even though that a lot of people in Zimbabwe have stated that, it's difficult for us to mention anything online because our names are on there, the government can come and, hunt us down or anything like that. These broadcasters do take in information anonymously as well. So you don't have to leave a name. You can just leave comments under a pseudonym or another name that you would want to go by in order to ensure anonymity and so that there's no threats to your immediate family or yourself. So it's a big issue to get around the acts that have been put in place by the Zimbabwe media. I mean, if these radio stations are found to be broadcasting from within Zimbabwe, they'll be immediately shut down, as was the case in 2002 of Voice of the People. But as I say, they found other alleyways to broadcast the information back into Zimbabwe.
Yes.
The internet has been one of the mediums. Another one that they've had quite a reasonable amount of success with is mobile phones. So they use mobile phones to beam news headlines to recipients. So all you have to do is be a subscriber to the website, and they will send you the news headlines. And they've also made quite an ingenious callback program where if you don't have the funds to call them, seeing as it's an overseas call, you send a message to a particular number and then they call you back, just so that they can get your views and opinions on what's actually happening on the ground. Again, this is just to get around all the different legislation that Zimbabwe has put in place in order to limit what information goes in and what information goes out. Obviously, you can't restrict something that's coming in via the mobile phones unless you put restrictions on the entire network.
And that's going to be way too complex.
It can get very out of hand.
Yes,
no, it can get very costly as well. I mean, in order to block the signal that's coming in from across the border for all these stations, they've had to employ technology that they've brought from overseas. So it does become costly for both the government, and at the same time, it is also costly for citizens, and in terms of what information they receive and don't receive. But the radio stations as well, that do take a certain hit, because trying to get around blocking transmission technologies it can become costly as well. So the mobile phone and the internet, they are effective at this present time, but the Zimbabwe government continuously tries to put in place barriers to prevent that information from coming into the country, as well as information from going out. So it is a very tense situation, but not having these pirate radio, as they're referred to, would be a bigger problem, because then there would be no outside view other than the mainstream view of the government.
Now, Ogi, tell me, what is your forecast for Zimbabwe and the media broadcasters that function within Zimbabwe? What is your forecast and predicament for the future? And what needs to be done to let loose some of these legislations so that the information can be broadcasted freely without the risk of being imprisoned for practicing illegally as a journalist within Zimbabwe?
At this present time, it's very, very difficult to tell, especially because just recently there was a referendum vote on the new constitution, which the majority of Zimbabweans voted yes for. And in terms of the power invested in the government, it's going to limit the president from only having 2 terms in office, 2 5-year terms. But at the same time, it will take away the post of prime minister. So if you do not have a second in command after the president, basically the president is the one that lays down the law and says what goes on in the country and what doesn't. Considering how strict the media has been governed for the past 15 or so years, it's only likely to remain so until there is some sort of economic stability and social stability in Zimbabwe. And at present, every time that elections take place, and it's not just in Zimbabwe, there's many other states throughout the continent that employ the very same methods of restricting the media. It will definitely have an impact on freedom in general, not just freedom of speech. Having the option to be more liberal in terms of the media will obviously get more opinion and more discussions going on the ground, but that's not what the government wants. The government wants less discussions to be happening on the ground and less meetings between different parties in order to conduct different topics that may be unfavorable to the government. I mean, right now there's many different listening posts, as they are called in Zimbabwe, where people gather in groups of 5, 10, 15, 20 people, sometimes more, just to listen to the radio, as this is the main medium of broadcasting news in Zimbabwe. The government has put a certain clampdown on these meetings purely because via the ability of certain different radio devices to pick up foreign signal, it means that they also have the ability to get news that is not from the mainstream, news that is in opposition to the government. And so if the rural population had to get hold of this news or were able to hear these news, it would be a problem for the government in power.
Now, okay, I have a question. With regards to broadcasting, you're restricted to broadcast within Zimbabwe, but what happens if you set up broadcasting facilities that border close to Zimbabwe, that feed into Zimbabwean ground, per se? Would that be allowed? Would that also be seen as illegal? Because factually it's not being broadcasted within Zimbabwean borders, but being fed from another bordering country.
Well, it would definitely not be illegal, seeing as it is coming from another state, and Zimbabwe doesn't have jurisdiction to shut down the airwaves from across the border. So what they have started doing in terms of clamping down on that as well is confiscating different radio sets that can actually pick up the signal, under pretense that they were brought into the country illegally or without license or any sort of reason that they can give, just so that they can take away these radios. I mean, most of these radios do not even run on electricity. You just wind them up, it has a dynamo, and it just works any time of day or night. And the signal strength that it can pick up it's substantial for what the country needs. And if that is possible, then obviously there will be different laws put in place and different restrictions put in place, like for instance the jamming of international signals, overseas technology, or restrictions being placed on imports, like for instance the handheld radios. So one way or another, the Zimbabwe government will continue to try to restrict the news that comes in through the borders, as well as what goes out. So there is little way to go around it, except via what these current pirate radio stations are doing, which is mobile phones or internet broadcasts, even podcasts. But looking at it more realistically, it's difficult for people to have access to the internet in Zimbabwe. And even if they do have access to the internet is normally very slow. So to try and download a podcast of, say, 15 to 20 minutes on a particular topic, it will prove a substantial challenge even for middle-class citizens. At the same time, many are very set in their ways and who they listen to. So if they're listening to the radio, they expect to hear familiar news. So anything in opposition can throw a certain amount of discord within a community, but at the same time, it's providing an alternative view. So the older generation is quite set in their ways in that aspect, but the newer generation is more open to change and to listening, for instance, on online feed and commenting on online news, and also making their voices heard via telephone.
So we can only hope for the best.
Indeed.
For the days to come.
Indeed.
Ogi, thank you so much for partaking in this discussion on the Voxit Show. A representative of YPIA is Ogi Williams, master student here at Monash, South African campus. Thank you so much, Ogi.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
Ogi, now if we want to get hold of you online, where do we go to?
Okay, well, we have websites, so it's ypia.org.za, that's ypia.org.za, and you can also give us a like on Facebook, it's Young People in International Affairs, or you can follow us on Twitter at YPIASA, that's all one word, no underscores, YPIASA.
Ogi, thank you so much for joining us here at the Voxit Show, and we are looking forward to having you next week.
Thank you so much, Peter.